We will be working with a text by Melanie Klein, which was a very important psychoanalyst. One could say, in a way, that she was the inventor of child psychoanalysis. Some people might dispute this, but in a way, she was the first one who really dared to use pretend play and symbolic play as equivalents to free association with children. And in this way, she thought, free association is the way that a psychoanalyst has access to the clients, the patients, right? Unconsciousness. So she thought, well, okay, a 4-year-old, for example, cannot free associate, but can play. And play is the equivalent of free association in children. And in this way, playing with them in the office, I have access to their unconsciousness. So in the same way that even if what you do in your private practice has nothing to do with psychoanalysis, for example, let's say you are doing ACT or you are doing cognitive behavioral therapy, still, this kind of setting in which a client comes to your office and talks about his or her life problems, and then you intervene at some point, this whole configuration, this was invented by Freud and by Breuer. Now, if you do child psychology, and it's a child, like brought by his or her parents, and then you have first initial interviews with the parents, and then you start working with this child. And of course, you will be playing with this child in the office. Who invented this kind of configuration? That was Melanie Klein. So most of our session today, we will use it to work on Melanie Klein's article. And from there, I hope we have time. We'll go back to Lacan's seminar, and then we'll see what has Lacan to say about Melanie Klein's work, which I think is very interesting. This is just a reminder of one specific concept that we were working on in our last meeting, and I think it's a very important concept. Like, before we understand what Melanie Klein is doing with the case she will be talking about, right? In the article we are discussing by Melanie Klein, she talks about one of her patients called Dick. To understand what Melanie Klein does with Dick, we need to revise again this concept that Freud was introducing. This is a Freudian concept that Lacan was introducing to us. And the concept, because it's Freudian, the name is in German, and it's Bejahung. And Bejahung means affirmation. There is this opposition between affirmation and negation. The last time we were together, we were talking about the concept of negation in Freud, which is Verneinung. But it is more interesting that what Lacan is doing is opposing Bejahung not to negation, but to another concept that Lacan uses, which is Verwerfung. We will try not to drive you crazy with these German words, but I think we still have no German speakers here. I hope at some point we have one. But this is the basic thing. Bejahung is affirmation, but Freud uses it in the sense of the most basic affirmation. You need to be alive. This basic libidinal force, erotic force that makes you want to be alive, connect with things, speak, love, work. In order for you to do that in the world, there has to be some kind of basic affirmation. You have been loved. You have been received in this world. There is a place for you. You feel accepted. You're part of something. This is like the basic Bejahung. Only if you have been affirmed in your existence from the very beginning, then it is possible for you to sometimes negate something. For example, I don't want to eat that food. This negation is dependent on a previous affirmation, a previous Bejahung. But Bejahung then, it's not opposed so much to negation as to Verwerfung, rejection, foreclosure. Right? And to explain this concept, Lacan was using one of Freud's famous cases, which is the case of the Wolfman. And Freud's reconstruction in the analysis of the Wolfman is that the Wolfman saw his parents having sex when he was 1 year and a half, and he was not prepared to process this scene that he was witnessing. It was, we would say today, it was traumatic. For some reasons that are above all theoretical, Lacan is not using this word, that this was traumatic, but he is saying that the Wolfman, this child at 1 year and a half, was not prepared to process what he was seeing. And so this scene was rejected for close. If I read this is from the seminar, from the pages we had for last week. I think it will make sense now that I gave you this context. Verwerfung, a rejection. Literally, it has always been, for him, for the Wolfman, as if the genital plane did not exist. They didn't have the symbolic means to understand what it means to have a penis, a vagina, the sexual difference, the genital order that is not only biological, it's symbolic. The Wolfman was not prepared to understand this. So he rejected this scene that he witnessed. We have been led to locate this rejection on the level, I would say, of the non-Bejahung, because we cannot place it on the same level as a negation, Verneinung, right? So again, I hope the German words are not too much, but he says, it's not a negation, because when I say, I would like to go to the movies tonight, this negation presupposes that I have been invited to the movies. And in more general terms, that I'm a speaking human being, that I live in a symbolic world in which we enjoy these fictions called movies, and I can be invited to the movies, and then I can reject the offer. So there is a basic Bejahung that allows me to do this negation. But what happens to the Wolfman when he watches this movie of his parents having sex is not a negation. It's not, no, I don't want to watch this. This is too much. Because he has not been included already in the symbolic order. So what happens to him is not a negation, but a non-Bejahung or a Verwerfung. Verwerfung, German word that Lacan finds in Freud's text, but it's not a technical term in Freud. And Lacan gives this word that Freud uses huge relevance. What happens when this Bejahung doesn't happen in such a way that nothing appears in the symbolic register? Nothing appears. This scene cannot be inscribed in the symbolic register. There is, at the level of completely primitive experience, this is Lacan, at the source point in which the possibility of the symbol lays the subject open to a certain relation to the world, a correlation, a balancing. This is very difficult to understand. I did it on purpose, selected one of these impossible sentences. Why? Because what we're trying to do, because this is in a way a reading club, is to do the experience of reading Lacan that very often will make you want to throw the book out of the window or directly in the trash bin, right? Because sometimes it looks like he's doing this on purpose. Why does he need to speak like this? But we can understand like this couple of things that, and by the way, so this is a digression, an anecdote. I once had the opportunity to talk to John Searle, who is a very important philosopher of language. He lives in Berkeley, in California. He teaches, right, in Berkeley. I think he still teaches. He must be like 80 now. So this was a long time ago. I was able to interview John Searle, and we were talking about French authors, and he told me that once he was in a conference with Michel Foucault, and he said to Foucault, "Hey, Michel, why do you have to write so difficult? Don't you find an easier way of explaining your ideas?" And Foucault replied to him, "If I write in an easy way, in a readable way, nobody would respect me in France," right? So apparently, to be part of this club of intellectuals in France, let's say, you can think about Derrida, Lacan, Deleuze, Foucault. You have to write in a difficult way. It's not cool to be so accessible. So this is also the game that Lacan is playing. But what he's talking about here is that very basic experience, right? And if at this basic point you are inscribed in a symbolic order, if there is the possibility of the symbol, then you can do this balancing, this correlation, like you are having an experience of the world and you're positioning yourself, for example, negating an experience or accepting it or relating it with something else. A balancing, a correlation, it can be traumatic, you can have nightmares, but what happened was Verwerfung. In a way, you cannot do this maneuvering, right? You are, in a way, not able to participate of the world. And this is what we will see. This is what's happening to Dick, to Melanie Klein's client. So today, I think what we use in our psychological jargon is be able to process. Right? So when you're not able to process anything that's happening, in your experience of the world, then it is traumatic, and it might return in, for example, flashbacks and or nightmares, the unprocessed scene that you are not able to talk about, to reflect on. Right? It's this kind of mechanism that Lacan is talking about, and Klein also, but on a very basic level. Like, are you participating of the symbolic world at all or not? For Lacan, since there was no Bejahung for the wolfman, no realization of the genital plane, right? No symbolic understanding of the difference between being male and being female, there is no trace of this plane in the symbolic register. The only trace we have of it is the emergence in the external world of a minor hallucination. So you might remember that one of the things that happens to a wolfman after he has watched this scene is that he has the hallucination that his finger has been cut. So this, in a way, is like a symbolic representation of castration. He hallucinates that his finger is almost completely cut and is hanging from just a little bit of skin, and he feels this is real. So it's a hallucination, but it's also an attempt at processing this scene, as saying there is a difference between having a penis and not having it. And there is a danger that I can be castrated just as my mom is. Castration, which is what didn't exist for him, manifests itself in the form of something he imagines to have cut his little finger so deeply that it hangs solely by a little piece of skin. In 1930, Melanie Klein publishes this article, The Importance of Symbol Formation in the Development of the Ego. And she presents there some theoretical ideas, but above all, the article centers on presenting this case of Dick. He's a 4-year-old. She sees he doesn't speak. His cognitive development is severely impaired, not adapted to reality, doesn't show any emotions, is like indifferent to people. When his nanny takes him to session, he doesn't cry when nanny left. He doesn't cling to nanny. We would have today that he would have maybe an avoidant attachment, right? But of course, that hadn't been invented yet, right? So what Melanie Klein says is, okay, he seems to not care whether the nanny is there or not, or mommy is there or not, doesn't display anxiety, and is completely indifferent in front of the toys box, right? Doesn't explore, shows no interest in the toys, doesn't play, doesn't explore the environment. And Melanie Klein gives us a little bit of context about the story of this kid. She says that her mom is rather cold with him, that his father is quite absent, so he has grown up in an environment that is pretty much devoid of love. It doesn't feel like a warm or loving environment, except for the last nanny that he has that takes him to session, that is a little bit more interested in this child. She then gives us a quick sketch of some of her theories. And what she, in classical Freudian theory, when Freud is talking about sadism, he locates this above all in terms of the anal stage, right? Is when we are playing this game of retention or expulsion that aggressive tendencies can appear. But Melanie Klein emphasizes that right from the very beginning, there are a lot of sadist tendencies and drives and fantasies in most children, being eaten by the mother, eating the mother, attacking the mother, incorporating her body, destroying it. There is this kind of oral sadism that she believes is very basic for the child's constitution of the world. So neither Klein nor Lacan use the term in this context, but we can say, if we think about what we were discussing just now, this oral sadism can only happen if there has been a bejahung, if the child is invested in the world in some way, has his libido exploring the world, that he can say, I want to incorporate this, or I'm angry that I'm not being fed, or I want to destroy this object, or I'm anxious that this object will now devour me, right? With this object that I have been aggressive with will now be aggressive against me, will eat me, for example. So these sadist tendencies for Melanie Klein are constituted of subjectivity. And the child has both this emotional, affective life and also defense. So the first defenses, and when we are talking about defenses in psychoanalysis, at this moment in the development of psychoanalysis, we're talking about the ego defenses. So we have this very incipient initial ego that is still forming, but this ego that is still forming defends itself against its id, against its libidinal tendencies, defends itself against its own sadism. So it can have guilt, it can be afraid of retaliation, it can show anxiety. And one crucial aspect for the child to be able to develop is whether the child can tolerate this anxiety. For example, the object has disappeared. Right? My mom is not here. The breast is not here. Is it because I have destroyed it? Will it be returned? Is it angry at me? All this makes me anxious. Can I tolerate this anxiety? I need to be able to tolerate this anxiety in order to explore the world, to develop my ego. And if the ego is unable to tolerate anxiety, then development will stop. The ego will cease to develop a fantasy life and to establish a relation with reality. So Melanie Klein says this beautifully, that, this is how she starts explaining her theory, that there is this metaphoric, symbolic element in our relation with reality that is very basic. Right? Our first reality is with mommy and with her body and with her breast. And from there, we need to start doing equivalencies with other objects. Is this also something that I can suck? Is this something that I can eat? Is this good? Is this bad? Is it warm like mommy? Is it? And we explore and establish equivalencies between the first object and all the subsequent objects. And this is why we are constituting a reality. This is a symbolic process. But if there is too much anxiety so that we cannot tolerate it, symbol formation will come to a standstill. And this is what she thinks is happening to Nick. He has no interest in the world except for only two things. We can say maybe there were two signifiers in the beginning. The only two things that are interesting for Dick, and Klein knows when she has this information, when she receives Dick for his first session, is he's interested in trains and train stations, and he's interested in everything that has to do with doors, opening and closing doors, door handles, etc. I think today he would be a candidate to be diagnosed as autistic. Of course, again, the category didn't exist, 1930, right? But if today, if you're a child psychologist and a child like this appears in your office, most likely it would be diagnosed as autistic. Actually, Melanie Klein ends the article saying that this was a psychosis, but that she was able to cure it. Okay, so how does she work here? It's wild. I don't know if you have read this. I don't know if you had the same impression as me. And this is also the impression that Lacan had. She doesn't wait. She's thinking. It's like an adult client that cannot free associate, that cannot speak, that doesn't take over his space, doesn't take up his space in the session. She has to intervene first. She has to do a symbolic intervention to get the show started. Right? So she starts making these assumptions. She makes all these assumptions before she sees the patient, right? She thinks that trains represent the penis of the father arriving to the station is like penetrating the mother's body, and that doors and locks also represent ways in which you enter and you exit the body. Door handles represent the father penis and also his own penis, right? And if what had been brought symbol formation to a still was the dread of what would be done to him, and particularly she thinks the fantasy is the father's penis counterattacking him after he had penetrated into the mother's body, then she believes this is so impossible to process, so terrifying, that the child is just incapable of any act of aggression. And I think this is a very nice example. If you don't have any aggression, you cannot relate to the world. Against this romantic view of childhood, aggression is one of the most basic elements. It's one of the most basic ingredients that you need to have subjectivity in a child. For example, and this I think is a very nice illustration, he didn't want to bite up food. Right? He could only eat like very soft food. I think she says pap, right? It's the only kind of food he can eat at 4 because he doesn't have the necessary aggression to bite and chew food. And he could also not use scissors or knives or basically any tool. And she believes, okay, this aggression is impossible for him to process. So, to summarize, Dick's development had come to grief because he could not bring into fantasy the sadistic relation to the mother's body. He lacked any affective relation to the things around him. He was indifferent. There was no special, no affective or symbolic relations with particular objects. So he's in the room, in the office of Melanie Klein as a plant, basically, not doing anything. But she has already decided the symbolic meaning of his interests. So the child comes into the room, the session starts, the nanny leaves. Melanie Klein says, when I showed him the toys, he looked at them without interest. I took a big train and put it beside a smaller one and called them Daddy Train and Dick Train. So you see how no introduction, 5 minutes into the office, she's already telling him, this train here, this is Daddy, and this train here is you. Is Dick. And then she says, the train station is Mommy. Dick is going into Mommy. So 5 minutes into session, she's representing to him the child penetrating the mother, the child realizing the Oedipal fantasy, right? The child having sexual intercourse with Mommy, penetrating her. She starts describing all the other reactions of Dick. One of the things he does is that apparently when you entered her office, there was a first door, then like a little hall, and then another door. So there was this little space in the room that was enclosed between these two doors. So Dick goes there, he shuts himself in, and he says dark and runs out again directly several times. And when he's doing this, she's saying to him, it is dark inside Mommy. Dick is inside dark Mommy. It's like saying, okay, you had a Verwerfung. I will give you the symbolic genital order, just like this, the whole package. So, but the child slowly starts to engage and responds to all her interventions. So, for example, in the third session, he starts looking at the toys with interest and starts developing this aggressive tendency. So he finds a little cold card and says, cut. She gives him a pair of scissors, but he's very clumsy. He's trying to scratch the little pieces of black wood that represents coal on this card. So he cannot do it. He gives it back to Melanie Klein, and she completes this. She cuts the coal from the card, and she explains to him that this coal represents Mommy's poop, and then he takes the damaged card and the coal and throws them into a drawer and says, gone. So she tells him, Dick, that he's cutting feces out of his mother. Then he ran into the space between the doors and scratched on the doors with the nails, thus showing that he identified the space with the card and both with the mother's body, which he was attacking. Right? So he's telling him, you're attacking your mom's body. At some point, he lifts a little toy man to his mouth, gnashes his teeth, and says, eat Daddy. So Melanie Klein writes, we came to recognize the father's penis and a growing feeling of aggression against it, the desire to eat it and destroy it. The introjection of the father's penis was associated with the dread of it, dread of the external and the introjected object. So she's not only giving words and dramatizing these child sexuality scenes and giving names to things and to actions, but she's also registering his emotional reaction when he's indifferent, when he starts showing some signs of anxiety, how he reacts to anxiety, whether becoming more aggressive or withdrawing. We go back to the theoretical discussion. She says, Dick cut himself off from reality and brought his fantasy life to a standstill. He took refuge in the fantasies of a dark, empty womb. He withdrew his attention from the objects in the outside world, which represented the contents of his mother's womb. The father's penis, feces children. So the idea is that all these objects in children's fantasies are usually the contents of the mother's body. And because this created a lot of anxiety in him, he just was withdrawing his attention from these objects. His own penis, an organ of sadism, and his own excreta were to be got rid of or denied as being dangerous and aggressive. Melanie Klein is aware about how controversial it is what she's doing, right? She, by the way, was born in Austria, like Anna Freud, which was the only important figure that was talking about psychoanalysis and children at that moment. She, I think in 1926, moved to England, started writing in English, and she's aware of that what she's doing is revolutionary and controversial. So she starts, without naming them explicitly, starts getting into this controversy without getting her adversaries, right? Without naming her adversaries, she starts getting into this controversy. And she says, yes, like she's answering to someone like, how come you do this? How do you dare to do this with a child whose ego is still so weak? Probably with this, I mean, all 4-year-olds have still not fully developed egos, even more the case of this child. Why are you doing this? And she says, it had been possible for me to gain access to his unconscious by getting into contact with rudiments of fantasy life and symbol formation as he displayed, right? So we can say there was like this tiny bit of Bejahung, this tiny bit of subjective development, even ego development and fantasy life and symbol formation. I needed to make contact with this incipient, basic, fragile fantasy life and symbol development, right? And when I do this, I start noticing that the latent anxiety, so that the anxiety that is not expressed probably tends to diminish, and so it is possible for a certain amount of anxiety to become manifest. So the idea is the latent anxiety that was making it impossible for this child to develop is decreasing because it's expressing itself as explicit anxiety, and explicit anxiety can be processed. This implied that the working over of his anxiety, today we would say the processing of this anxiety, was beginning by way of the establishment of a symbolic relation to things and objects. And at the same time, his epistemophilic and aggressive impulses were set in action. Finally, this child starts to be interested in reality, aggressive, present. Every time Melanie Klein feels that she's providing one of these interpretations, she sees Dick releasing anxiety, showing this anxiety. This makes him temporarily withdraw. So he withdraws. And then after he turns away for the things that were causing this anxiety, he can displace this anxiety or displace this interest to a new object and start forming new affective and objective relations with other objects. So his aggressive impulses were then redirected to new objects and affective relations. He investigated the hinges of the door, the way in which it opened and shut, the lock, climbed up inside the cupboard and asked what the different parts were called. He now began to take more and more interest not only in the things themselves, but in their names. And she starts noticing an increasingly strong transference, and so the object relation is making its appearance. This is how this English school of psychoanalysis that was founded by Melanie Klein come to be known as object relation theory. And also, Melanie Klein starts noticing that, for example, the child starts anticipating when it's time for him to be picked up, or has a hard time parting from the nanny when she's leaving him at Melanie Klein's office. She's not thinking he's scared of me, right? She's thinking, oh, now he has the bond with the nanny and it's hard for him to say goodbye. So he's showing this interest in people and in objects. So she knows that what she's doing is not orthodox at all. So she says, in general, I do not interpret the material until it has found expression in various representations. In this case, where the capacity to represent it was almost entirely lacking, I made my interpretations on the basis of my general knowledge. So she's saying, in general, even with adults, when the adult comes, you don't throw your interpretations and your prejudices at them in the first session. You create space for them to free associate and to speak. Right? But in this case, she thinks this was not possible. So she needed to use her general knowledge of the development of children, of psychoanalysis, the information she had from his caretakers, and she used this from the first session. Finding access to his unconscious, I succeeded in activating anxiety so that it was worked over in a better way, namely by its distribution amongst new things and interests. In this manner, it became tolerable for the ego, and the ego can develop again. Access to the unconscious has to be by way of the ego, so the one who speaks, the one you're talking to in this conscious way is the ego, but the idea is that through the ego you access the unconscious. Even this very imperfectly developed ego was adequate for establishing connection with the unconscious. From the theoretical point of view, it is important to note that even in so extreme a case of defective ego development, it is possible to develop both ego and libido by analyzing the unconscious conflicts without bringing any educational influence to bear upon the ego. So this specific paragraph is written against Anna Freud, right? Freud's daughter. She says, children cannot be analyzed. They cannot establish neurotic transference with an analyst. Their ego is not strong enough to be in transference. For them, we become like real people, not this kind of equivocation or symbolic interaction that happens between an adult and the analyst, when the analyst can represent other people for the patient, right? This doesn't happen with children. For children, we are real people because the ego is not developed enough, because there's not this kind of transference established, and above all, because the ego is not strong enough to be part of this process. So what Anna Freud recommends is work with the parents and help parents in the process of education. Educate children. This is what a child therapist does. And Melanie Klein is saying, you are dead wrong, Anna Freud. You can use pretend play and symbolic play as free association. And Melanie Klein is saying against Anna Freud, we need not fear that in neurotic children, the ego might succumb to the id. So the ego is strong enough, you can do pretend play, and you can help children process things, elaborate fantasies, discover the world, and this can happen in the context of transference with an analyst. Even in a child like Dick, who had such an arrested development, it was still possible to establish transference. So she says, this was a psychosis, and I cured it, and the sadistic appropriation and exploration of the mother's body and of the outside world. And this is a very interesting idea. Just think about this. I think that just this sentence for me, only this sentence is enough to be grateful that I read this article. What is the world for a child? It's the mother's body in an extended sense. So when you're born, your world is your mom's body. And from there, you conquer the world. And the world is nothing else than the mother's body in an extended sense. But this process of extension was brought to a standstill in the case of Dick. This causes the suspension of the symbolic relation to the things and objects representing the contents of the mother's body, and hence of the relation to the subject's environment and to reality. The appropriation and destruction of the interior of the mother's body, as conceived in fantasy, together with the establishing of the relation to reality, was prevented or checked owing to anxiety. I will try to say in 5 minutes what Lacan has to say about this article, which is it's brief, so we can do it. Also, these pages by Lacan also include his commentary on one of Anna Freud's cases. We will not discuss that, right? Because it would be too much. But I just want to say this, that Lacan considers that Anna Freud's point of view is intellectualist. Everything in analysis for her must be conducted from a medium, moderate position, which would be that of the ego. So Anna Freud is the founder of ego psychology, and she's defending the ego and the right emotional maturation and affective maturation and the right adaptation to the world. And so what you do with children is educate them from this centered, medium, moderate position. an intellectualist position. For her, for Anna Freud, everything starts with the education of or the persuasion of the ego, and everything must come back to that. The opposite of what Melanie Klein does. Melanie Klein connects directly with the unconscious. Young children, for Anna Freud, do not meet the fundamental condition of analysis, the capacity for a stable transference neurosis. Their ego is still developing, and their ties to the real parents are too immediate and dominant. A couple of paragraphs that I took from Lacan. This is Lacan discussing Melanie Klein's article. And look how he talks here. Yes, she slams the symbolism on him with complete brutality. That's Melanie Klein on Little Dick. Straight away, she starts off hitting him large-scale interpretations. She hits him a brutal verbalization of the Oedipal myth. You are a little train, you want to fuck your mother. So now this also creates some kind of discussion about what reality is. You know that Lacan distinguishes three registers. The imaginary, this is where fantasies are played out, the symbolic, the world of language, and the real. The real is a difficult notion that evolved. So Lacan in the 50s uses the word the real in a sense that is not the same the way he used it in the 50s or in the 70s, right? This changed. In a way, we can say that reality was not constituted for Dick because it's like the environment is neutral, has no meaning for him, no affect, no symbols, no words. This human symbolic reality in which we distinguish objects and we show interests and we assert ourselves in the world. This was not possible for Dick. But in another sense, maybe in the sense that animals inhabit the world, reality was all there was for Dick. And so Lacan says, this young subject is completely in reality, in the pure state, unconstituted. He is entirely in the undifferentiated now. What constitutes a human world, if not the interest brought to bear on objects as distinct entities or as equivalent ones? The human world is an infinite world as far as its objects are concerned. In this respect, Dick lives in a non-human world. So I think that even though Lacan is ironic about Melanie Klein's intervention, he agrees with her. Clearly, he prefers Melanie Klein to Anna Freud. This idea that this Bejahung has not happened, the symbolic world or the symbolic order has not been constituted except in a very fragmentary, incomplete way, and that in a way, depends on how you use the word reality, right? Dick is not living in human reality, but he's living in this more basic, indifferent, neutral reality. So it's hard to tell whether he's showing real admiration here, Lacan, towards Melanie Klein, or he's being ironic because he's saying, this text is a precious one because it comes from a therapist, a woman of experience. She feels things, she expresses them badly. One cannot blame her for that. So he is being ironic, right? Or just even dismissive when he says she expresses them badly. But he, in a way, I think has also huge respect for her when he's saying, okay, and I think that's the contrast, right? Anna Freud is not operating as a psychoanalyst. Melanie Klein is. So he agrees, if in the human world objects become variegated, develop with a luxuriance that makes for its originality, it is to the extent that they make their appearance within a process of expulsion linked to the instinct of primitive destruction. So this basic idea that there has to be some kind of basic sadism in the child in order to conquer the world and to establish these symbolic distinctions, Lacan agrees about this with Melanie Klein.